Supreme Court and High Court, we never talked about who is going to implement those directions. How will they implement those directions? Other than the government or the political will, was there any finance with the government to deal with those issues? We never talked about finance, and that is something that's lacking. Today, it has become increasingly clear that without adequate financing, advancing the environmental agenda is simply not feasible. This realization has brought nature finance to the forefront of discussions, emphasizing that sustainable progress in environmental protection and climate action requires robust financial backing. Nature finance is now recognized as a cornerstone for achieving environmental and climate goals, highlighting a critical shift in our approach to addressing these challenges. But more of this in a bit. As opposed to environmental justice, which circled around polluter, climate justice unveiled an entirely new and complex canvas for us at the courts. The challenge lies in addressing the broader and more severe macro effects of climate change, such as extreme weather events that disrupt agriculture, health, food security, urban planning, building regulations, industrial licensing, technology, human resources, human displacement, climate-induced trafficking, disaster preparedness, and public health systems. Climate justice emerges as a broader and more nuanced framework than traditional environmental justice, especially for the global south. While environmental justice primarily focused on the equitable distribution of environmental benefits and burdens, climate justice encompasses health security, food security, energy security, water security, human displacement, human trafficking, and disaster management, recognize the intricate interplay between these sectors. So a judge in Pakistan who is looking at climate justice is looking at a whole different world than a judge sitting in the north looking at climate justice, because he's just looking at mitigation, which is a very linear way of looking at climate justice. But I think the scope of adjudication in Pakistan changes when you look at climate justice in the global south. So for the global south, climate justice introduced a significant shift in jurisprudence. It demanded a more sophisticated and inclusive approach to adjudication, one that accounts for multidimensional impacts of climate change across multiple sectors. This necessitates remedies that go beyond retributive measures against polluters and instead adopts restorative and rehabilitative approaches. Courts are now required to design adaptive remedies to protect the rights and dignities of communities disproportionately affected by climate change. So we have to come up with how to come up with a more resilient urban planning, how to come up with a more resilient agricultural planning, climate resilient irrigation plans. This is something that we need to look at. We have a case that comes before us, does not talk about climate change. It might talk about irrigation and water scarcity, but actually you're looking at a climate change issue. There was a case that came to us, they said that we want to expand the cement plant in Kalar Kahar, the DG cement case. There was nobody argued climate change in that case. They said we just want to add on, expand the cement plant in Kalar Kahar. And we said no, Kalar Kahar is a water scarce area, and we did not allow that expansion. But hidden in that entire case was the whole concept of climate change, because it's a water scarce country. So this evolution of adaptive climate justice or adaptive jurisprudence, which just belongs to Pakistan or the global south, unlike the north, marks a pivotal moment in the legal landscape where the scope of justice is expanded to address interconnected challenges that were previously outside the purview of environmental law. We now suggest climate resilient urban planning, agriculture, irrigation, farming practices, etc. So the scope increases. If we examine the climate jurisprudence, we see that it has been largely directional. So what have we done in the last maybe 5-7 years? Coming up with very interesting jurisprudence, which has been globally quoted now, especially Asghar Laghari case and some of the others. People talk about it internationally. But what has happened in Pakistan? Has anything changed as far as climate justice is concerned? No, I would imagine. Because all we did was we gave directions. Please do fix this. Please go do fix this, come up with a new plan to do this, but never figured out whether at all the government had political will, but that's aside, did they ever have the money to do this? Or did they have the budget to do this? We never talked about it somehow. The government never raised this question before us either. So while the courts kept on directing in Asghar Lagari, DG Cement, and a number of other score of cases that we'll do this, CDA was directed to come up with a design which is climate resilient. All buildings in Islamabad should be urban climate resilient, but nothing really happened. The directions are there, they've been quoted all over the world, the jurisprudence is very robust and exciting, but nothing happens on the ground. So debate and discussion at the recent COP29 at Baku brought a fresh perspective of what is really not happening. To address these challenges, to achieve meaningful adaptation or to succeed in a claim for loss and damage caused due to climate change, climate finance becomes an indispensable lifeline. So climate change may be global, but the solutions are not shared equally. Those with resources hoard them, leaving the most vulnerable to perish, said Greta Thunberg. So for a country like Pakistan, which is highly vulnerable to climate change, the availability of robust financial resources is critical for building resilience and protecting its people. Climate finance supports adaptive measures like food defenses, flood defenses, drought-resistant crops, sustainable urban infrastructure, and community-based disaster response systems. Climate finance ensures that individuals can live lives marked by dignity and security, with access to basic needs such as clean water, safe shelter, reliable food supplies. So in essence, climate finance is not just an economic necessity, it is a moral imperative. It ensures that the most vulnerable, who have contributed the least to global emissions, have the resources to adapt, survive, and thrive in the changing world. For Pakistan, climate finance is not merely a tool for policy, it is the foundation of hope for the future, where every citizen can live with dignity, security, and promise of a better tomorrow. So climate finance is not about helping, it is about restoring justice in a system that is fundamentally skewed against the global south. Climate finance refers to what? Where do we get this climate finance? So climate finance refers to local, national, or transnational funding drawn from public, private, and alternative sources of financing that seeks to support adaptation actions that will address climate change. Its origins trace back to the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which establishes the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. This principle acknowledges that while all nations share a common responsibility to combat climate change, developed nations bear a greater burden due to their historic contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. So ensuring climate finance, and this is the judicial approach, or at least what we're thinking now, and I don't know how the executive looks at it, but this is how the judiciary is probably going to look at it. Ensuring climate finance is therefore the most pivotal part of climate justice. I think the next decade, the jurisprudence that's going to come out of Pakistan should be talking about how do we go about getting in climate finance and how best could we arrange that. So climate finance is actually our lifeline, if you look at it, that can help us strengthen our infrastructure, agriculture, water management, economic inequality, and disaster resilience. The climate finance is going to do all this. And it must be mobilized on an unprecedented scale and be accessible in a timely manner to those who need it the most. So without climate finance, our right to life, which is Article 9 of the Constitution, our right to human dignity, which is Article 14, is under threat to our understanding. Therefore, climate finance in countries from the global south like Pakistan is fundamentally a human right. And that's what I want to underline. I think climate finance is the new human right, and that has to be examined and looked at in that context of climate justice, as it is essential to preserving human life and human dignity. Human dignity has a major role to play when you talk about displacement, when you're talking about your entire crops being totally destroyed, you don't know where to take your agriculture, where to go, and where to build a new livelihood. So if climate finance continues to fall short, the gap between developed and developing nations may grow, leading to what now some people term as climate apartheid, where wealthy nations protect themselves from climate impacts while poorer nations are left to bear the brunt. So where is this climate finance? And this is what I want to address and highlight. Climate finance would largely come from the global funds under the Paris Agreement. So we have the Green Climate Fund, GCF, very good, established under the UNFCCC to channel about $100 billion annually by 2020 to developing countries, as it said. performance. They've just pledged $40 billion and far below its target. The issues, the disbursement rate is slow. Only 25% of the pledged funds have been disbursed. And I looked around and I looked at the architecture behind these funds. How do we access these funds? How do we reach out to these funds? What's the process? It's unbelievably difficult. You can't reach out to these funds. How do you go about it? How do you handle dispute settlements? How do you negotiate on this? Suppose you say our loss and damage or my adaptation budget is 20 billion and they say no, we just think it's 10 billion. How do we settle that issue? Where does the issue of climate science come in? Is the country prepared with climate science to argue and articulate a claim before these international forums? So to me, it's like truck ki batti ke piche hum lage hue hain. There is nothing that's coming our way. So I just want to highlight that this global finance that we're talking about, it's not actually trickling down. I mean, as a judge, I looked at, there are no procedures, there's no architecture, there's no regulatory framework on how does it actually go. It falls outside our jurisdiction, we can't really enforce it, for which I propose that there has to be an international climate court because there's no way you police all these things, but there is no mechanism available, and that sort of worries me because this is going on for such a long time and nothing is trickling down. Similarly, adaptation fund. So there is nothing really that's coming down. The loss and damage mechanisms are also there, but emerging under decisions made under COP27 to address irreparable climate losses in vulnerable nations. Now, let me highlight that loss and damage is an immediate requirement. You need that money immediately. We need $20 billion to fix the flood issue, you see. So that's the money that you require immediately, whereas adaptation could be slightly more continuous, slightly long-term, but loss and damage is an immediate requirement, but nothing is actually coming our way. So as far as loss and damage is concerned, implementation is still in its infancy with no clear funding architecture or substantial disbursements. Highly politicized with donor countries resisting mandatory contributions. So challenges in accessing global climate funds, there are bureaucratic hurdles. Then we have stringent eligibility criteria which we cannot meet. Inequitable distribution, larger developing countries with better institutional capacities like India and Brazil often secure more funds, leaving smaller or more vulnerable nations behind. Small island developing states, SIDS and LDCs receive minimal funds despite being the most vulnerable. So power imbalance also, decision making in global funds is often dominated by donor countries with limited input from the recipient nations. So this goes on and there's a slow disbursement rate as we look at it. That worries me, see. There's also a political resistance to this. What has been the response of the government? Well, I think they did put up a good show at Baku, and I think the current advisor to the Ministry of Climate Change, Mrs. Rumina Khalid, is trying to do as much as she can, and I compliment her efforts. But, you know, there is nothing much that comes out. And I look at their official statement, and they say, we've just finalized the National Climate Finance Strategy. Very good. Where is it? What is it? I haven't seen it. It's just being finalized somewhere. So, and they say that we've applied, we've made applications to the Green Fund. Nobody gives a figure as to what money has actually come to Pakistan against it. And they keep referring to figures, and I don't want to bother you with those. It talks about a number of figures, but nothing really clearly shows what's the amount that has actually come to Pakistan. So this goes on. So what do we do then? We could have some other options also. Okay. Actually, I'm not used to this in the courts, but not part of my structure, so nobody tells me how much to see, but I'll just shut up in just a while. So I'll just cut through this, but some of the initiatives that the government wants to take is to reach out to the vulnerable 20. V20 as is and we're trying to come up with a coalition of judges in the V20 countries and see if we can come up with a strategy on climate justice and see what climate diplomacy can go into it and see. But let me just quickly now, considering that I just have 5 minutes, I thought we could rely on alternative sources of Islamic finance. That's another big area, and there are a number of areas that you can go into that and see if we can raise money through Islamic finance, carbon markets. All of this is still in discussions. Nothing is really come through. Maybe some other Islamic countries have done this, but we haven't reached out and done that yet. So I just want to then quickly, as a conclusion, see as to what the approach of the judiciary is going to be as to what we can do about all this, because otherwise, the climate finance, as far as the executive and the government is concerned, I see that still there is no money. As I said, there could be domestic, you can raise money domestically through private players like the carbon markets. We could have the Islamic finance going. Let me also tell you that the Climate Finance Act 2017 talks about climate fund. And recently at the Supreme Court, we took up this case, earlier took up this case under the constitutional bench, to which I'm not yet a party. So now the new constitutional bench will look into it, but we're talking about there is no authority. The law came out in 2017. We're sitting in 2024. There is no authority, climate change authority, which is an apex body looking at climate change in Pakistan. So there is no authority. So the court reached out to the government and directed them to come up with an authority. They're still working on it and interviewing people how to get the authority in place, and maybe they will soon do it. The second question that we asked them in the court was that under the law there is a climate change fund. Is there any money in the fund? Is the fund created? There is no fund established. Considering that climate change is the most serious existential threat Pakistan is facing, there is no climate change fund under the Climate Change Act 2017 as we speak, and nothing was allocated in the recent budget either, which is sad. So, secondly, there are no rules. Even if there was a climate change fund in Pakistan, how does an individual access it? If my lands have been destroyed because of climate change due to drought, how do I access the climate fund? What's the mechanism? What are the rules? Where is the, how does this get, how do we work through this? We don't know. So the pattern globally role in this area, and that could be by considering, and I think the first and foremost is the recognizing climate finance as a fundamental right. So that's one, that's the beginning as far as we are concerned. I don't know what executive is doing, and I don't know what the politicians are up to, but at the courts we think recognizing climate finance as a fundamental right is important, because right to life, right to dignity, even right to fair trial could come into it, and right to non-discrimination. Courts can recognize climate finance as a fundamental human right, emphasizing its necessity for the survival and development of vulnerable communities by establishing a clear judicial understanding that climate finance is tied to the right to life, health, and sustainable environment. Courts can push for stronger legal obligations for both domestic governments and international entities. We could also, as we're looking at it, we think that obligations of the global north be viewed as climate debt and push the governments to press their claims more forcefully. Climate justice focuses on climate finance and more so on reparative justice. So to my mind, climate justice now moves on to climate finance, but climate finance also further moves on to reparative justice, which focuses on compensating communities or individuals for harm caused by environmental degradation. So if the compensation isn't coming, then the entire literature, the entire debate is meaningless to my mind. So it has to be now, the future of climate justice is reparative justice. There has to be compensations coming our way so that we actually tangibly change things. The judiciary plans to have a serious judicial oversight over climate financing, pushing the government to making their claims internationally or even locally, but nothing so far has happened in that direction, but that can be done. So in addition to this, just last point, that in addition to climate change and our view of climate justice, we also want to view climate change as a part of the triple planetary crisis that UN has identified, which is climate change, loss of biodiversity, and pollution, which we just talked about. So I think we require nature finance, another initiative in the country, to look at pollution and to look at biodiversity loss, because they're all interconnected. Loss of biodiversity, pollution has a direct bearing on climate change, and climate change in reverse has a bearing on this. So this is how we can go about looking at the future by underlining that climate finance is something critical and most important, and we can't sort of possibly move without attending to the issue of climate finance. And I'll just end it with a quote from President of Kiribati, who said that the Global South is tired of empty words on climate finance. We need accountability, fairness, and funds that address our realities, not token gestures. But that's where we stand today. Thank you so much.
Given that farmers have sort of traditional years, they've become the real scapegoats on the air quality conversation. And I know this is a loaded statement in itself, that they've been made scapegoats, because there is data to suggest that they have a significant contribution. But that contribution is really over a period of 2 to 3 weeks, twice a year. Yet we see air quality being a problem consistently throughout the year. So perhaps targeting this one community, which is already pretty vulnerable, and coming up with models which are suggested that perhaps some harsher penalties are required to create a deterrent on this already sort of vulnerable community or underprivileged community. Do you not think that would be more counterproductive, even at a policy and governance level?
You want to answer?
Can I ask you to hold off? Can we hear from, yes, go ahead. So we'll collect 3 more and then you'll have a chance to respond. Go ahead.
Assalamualaikum. My question is for Justice Mansoor Shah. One of the outcomes of Pakistan's extreme vulnerability to climate change is the increase in the number of climate migrants. Over the next 5 years, the number is expected to be 1.2 million. Now, as a student of business, and I think as my interest is in a more data-centric approach, and I feel that if we have a proper definition of climate migrant as a legal definition and not just the one that we use in academic circles, we would be able to deploy our limited climate finance resources to serve climate justice to these vulnerable communities. So I would like to understand from you, what are the challenges that we face in not being able to come up with legal definitions so far, globally or nationally?
So we'll just take 1 more and then, yes, go ahead. Yes.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. I am Mehboob Sultan, member of the Punjab Assembly from Shah Chakpal. And first of all, I would like to thank you all the panelists for your knowledgeable discussion and your debate. And my question is for Justice Mansoor Shah. As you have mentioned in your talking points about the cement plants and their issues, and I would like to ask you the same question. I remember Supreme Court has taken suo motu about the Qatar's Raj pond, which were dried up. And I believe, I don't know where it was ended, because probably it was ended on a compromise between the Supreme Court or the cement plant, because the Qatar's Raj pond still has no water, and they were supposed to bring the water from the Jordan River, which they never did. So I would like to ask you to comment, or maybe you can answer. Thank you very much.
Before I forget all the questions. So, answering that question first, we don't have a case so far for us regarding the migrant issue, but yes, if one comes up, I think a definition would be required or an explanation would be required. Yes, we'll do that once a matter comes up, but yes, I agree with you that, we're trying to put as much, climate finance into all the relevant areas, but such a case hasn't yet come before us as to how to allocate climate finance and look at finance and the challenges of climate as yet. But sooner or later, when it does come up, I think there will be time to go ahead and define climate migrant also, climate refugee also, a number of other things. But I was just saying about all these things a bit ahead of the curve, and says it hasn't happened yet. But sooner or later it will be required, and I see in the next decade the jurisprudence ought to flow in that direction as I see it. The judicial approach is going to be towards climate finance, because without that nothing can happen actually. So you have to kind of wait and see what happens sooner or later. As to your comment, firstly, we don't have a slow motor power anymore, but that makes you happy. That's been taken away in this other week, this 26th Amendment of ours, which is equally big as the climate change issue. In that case, a slow motor was taken and they directed that yes, water ought to be brought in and the temple ought to be filled with water. I think it never happened. It never happened. Indirectly, another case came before me was the DG Cement case, where they were trying to expand the cement plant. And it was interconnected with that issue because the water had dried in the area and the government had stopped the expansion of the cement plant because of the reason that there was no water in the area. And one example was that the temple had all dried up. So we said no, and we brought in the climate angle, and even though the cement plant had argued at that time that we'll bring water and we'll make pools and we'll do this, and that they could not do either. So I think it just went nowhere. I mean, it was just a direction in the air and nothing happened. So that's also something that I was talking about, that there's a lot of difference in giving directions and what happens on the ground. And in order to even fill those tanks with water, you require a lot of design and sort of a lot of money to do this. I don't know how would that be achieved, and the government probably didn't really say anything about it. So my understanding is that that just disappeared. And this is the sad part of the slow motor part also. I mean, directions which are not possible to implement. And so yeah, that's the sad part, but that chapter is over, I guess.
Saad, do you want to respond? And then I think we have time for another round of questions.
So I think the farmer question is an important one. Of course, it's a vulnerable community, but first, from a legal perspective, the matter has already been decided. Crop burning is illegal. So the legislators or our elected representatives have made the call that this is something that needs to be prevented. But I think from another perspective, from a public social planner perspective, air pollution is the largest issue for us as a community right now. Several million people die every single year in South Asia, deaths that are directly attributed to poor air. And then there are many other deaths that we don't even know about, other public health diseases that we don't know about. So we have to go at this problem from every single angle that is possible. But of course, it is true that the populations that are most vulnerable are the ones that get the worst, blunt end of the stick immediately. So we should be obviously cognizant of that. But I think the issue is that you have to kind of address this problem both in the short term and in the medium to long term. My research is focusing specifically on crop burning. That's not to say that other problems also are not the ones that need to be curtailed. But at least on the crop burning end, I hope that I've shown that there is a reasonable effect that you can have immediately with the existing governance institutions. And so you should do that and other things as well. I don't think it's an either-or scenario anymore.
Okay, so we have time for one more round. We will collect them.
Presented a paper on climate finance. We're happy to share it with you. And basically, there are going to be two sources of climate finance. Private finance, and that will come into lots of adaptation technologies, including energy. And that really will depend on what kind of improvements we make in our domestic governance framework, under which foreign investment comes to the country. The second source is going to be concessionary finance, and that, as somebody said, depends considerably on how we'll manage our fiscal situation currently. So I'm afraid if you get into the area of climate finance, you'll find judiciary coming into lots and lots of areas of economic governance, which from our angle is very welcome, but it may require another constitutional amendment.
You're next.
What I feel as an observer is the civil for water and its treatment, and the onus or the ownership also needs to shift to the industrial side and the housing schemes that we have seen mushroom.
So should we not also make a shift in the way we think and execute policies? Thank you.
I think we just have time for our two panelists to respond. Unfortunately, हमें कमरा खाली करना है, but I'm sure the conversation can continue. So whoever wants to go
I think they
first.
were largely comments, very good comments. I'll leave it to that. But I think what Dr. Nabi earlier said, I think that's a governance issue. And a governance issue is certainly a very serious issue. I mean, all these things that you've identified are very important, and we should address this, and that's for the executive and the governments of the day to consider. I was just giving a judicial approach to this as to how we could push things, and as rightly pointed out, that the third sector ought to be involved. And I was about to say that because of limitation of time, I couldn't, because when the court sort of decides things and the court intervenes, it does mobilize public opinion, and that is very important. So yes, it's all interconnected. Governance is the heart of it.
I'll just add that the
climate change policy or a climate change plan, and you'd be surprised that once we asked them, they said we're just making one, and so I thought that's not right. I mean, so I don't want to sort of blame anybody, but I'm just saying that they're not ready with it. They're not with it, and that we see, and I think the court at least plays a role in pushing them to do this, for which we need to understand economics, we need to understand climate science, and we need to understand this entire governance structure ourselves also, for which I think we need to come up with some sort of plan on that account also. But increasingly we see that there is no great interest as far as climate interest. We actually not taking it as the most serious existential threat. We're not. There are other issues we're attending to. So at least the court is sensitizing and pushing the government to look into that.
I just want to thank you all for your time.